This podcast represents my opinions and the opinions of my guests. This is not medical advice, and I'm not establishing a physician-patient relationship with any listener. The content here should not be taken as medical advice. The content here is for informational purposes only, and because each person is so unique, please consult with your healthcare professional for any medical questions that you may have.
Welcome back, everyone. We're back again for another episode of the Not Your Doc podcast. We're here with Mr. Not Your Doc himself, Dr. Charles Tadros. How are you today?
Hey, fine, Vanessa. Another gorgeous day outside. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good to be here for sure. Things have been busy, but stuff's going good. And I'm very excited about this episode that we have today for sure. It's going to be a little bit different than what we set people up with so far, correct?
I'm glad that you're here. You're the one that softens all the hard hitting topics I like to bring on board. So you'll make it more human.
That's what we're giving people here is hard hitting journalism. All right. So as we said in our pilot episode, this podcast is about a lot more than just mental health diagnoses and their treatments, including ketamine, of course. We promise to present our listeners with conversations about a wide range of topics that affect people's overall health and quality of life, including, work, money, relationships, family dynamics. So today we're taking our first step outside of the psychiatric topics that we presented so far. So we talked about anxiety and depression, and some other medical things as well. And we're going to discuss another issue brought to us by Dr. Tadros, and that topic is intimate partner violence and the dynamics of power and control. And obviously, while domestic violence and abuses of power can occur between couples of any variety, right, including same-sex partners, parents and children, bosses and employees, siblings, for example, for the sake of limiting this and making it an hour-long episode and not a 10-hour marathon, we're going to put a narrow focus on today's discussion to examine the dynamics of power and control as they can manifest in heterosexual partnerships. So where the male is the one seeking power and control over a female partner.
That's right.
So before we get into it, Dr. Tadros, I know, and bear with us, everybody. I know this seems a little bit heavy and overwhelming. I promise this is going to be a really good and edifying conversation if you just stick it out with us. Mm-hmm. But before we get into it, you've told us before that the topics you write about in your blog and the things you hope to bring forward on this pod are based on, many of them are based on your observations from decades of experience treating and talking to patients in your primary care practice. Mm-hmm. So very broadly, can you talk about the things that you've seen and experienced that have kind of inspired you to bring this topic up? Do you think it's a prevalent problem in, the relationship dynamics of the people that you've treated over the years?
Yeah. Thank you for being here to moderate. Absolutely. I started practice 30 years ago, roughly, and early in my practice, I recognized many of the men I was seeing as part of my general internal medicine practice had all sorts of issues. There were mental health issues. It's not that this is not mental health issues, but
right, sure.
A lot of it revolved eventually, by the time they saw me, around distress regarding their relationships, oftentimes marriage, sometimes just girlfriends. But a lot of it was in terms of anger issues coming especially from the man, and oftentimes physical violence. And sometimes these men got in enough trouble that police were called and they were court mandated to seek help. They were coming to me because of depression. They were coming to me because of anger issues, substance abuse issues, et cetera. And what I obviously found out pretty quickly is that they themselves had been probably abused as youngsters.
Yeah.
And they grew up to be abusers. And there's an enormous amount of shame. There's certainly men don't talk about it, not to other men, and oftentimes not even to their therapists. But there's an enormous amount of shame, a lot of guilt, And of course, there's there are family repercussions, and there are financial repercussions. And when people just come to see me to help them sleep or help their anxiety or help their depression, and I find out that they're having all sorts of troubles, work trouble, financial trouble, but also it's trickling into their relationships in terms of physical violence, and then I just can't just throw Prozac or Ambien at them.
Right.
I have to delve a little more deeply. And a lot of times, of course, I don't have the time or the experience, and we need the help of others. And so probably 25, 28 years ago, I found, back then it was in Maplewood, a place that was run by volunteers for men who were physically, emotionally violent towards their partners. Some of them were there because of court mandated, but a lot of them they were voluntarily. A lot of them they were sent by their medical professionals. And I sat in on a few sessions to see what was happening, and that really caught my attention that these men needed a lot more help than just a simple internist and what I could do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's amazing. Did you ever sit in on a session there at that organization? What was that like for you?
Oh yeah, no, it was in a upstairs room, and it was run by essentially former graduates. I don't know if anybody graduates, but former graduates. They were not mental health professionals, but people who were trained in the kind of the Duluth power and control wheel philosophy of power and control, and we could talk about what power and control versus violence means. And that was a technique that we used. It revolved around power and control, helping men understand what they were seeking, how they were seeking it, how destructive it was whenever they had to. They end up using violence and control, and how they minimized what they did and what they said, and how it affected other people.
Right.
And some of the most basic, these were men I remember I sat next to a truck driver, a minister, a physician, a dog trainer, and so from all sorts of...
So not everybody sitting there looked like, oh, that's an obvious wife beater there.
No, absolutely not. A lot of them were professionals. A lot of them were everybody was working. Nobody was homeless, et cetera. And so it was very eye-opening, and I think it continues to be eye-opening. That's
pretty incredible. Okay, so let's start with some really basic definitions and a little bit of framework for today's discussion. And part of this is for my own benefit, so I can sort of set up some mental scaffolding on how I'm going to understand this conversation and hopefully get us through it. But so first of all, let's establish the type of relationship we're talking about today. And that's an intimate relationship and partnership between an adult man and an adult woman.
That's right.
So typically the goal of these partnerships between men and women is for both people to share resources in order to get their needs met, right? So physical, safety, emotional, sexual needs. And the way I'm thinking about it too is like if you can picture Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the triangle pyramid with those, physiological needs on the bottom, moving up to love and acceptance and self-actualization, like from an evolutionary perspective, humans that live and work together as partners are more likely to be able to meet those basic needs and then ascend the hierarchy. And obviously, have children or longer lives or anything like that. So partners, especially today, typically share homes, money, food, hobbies, families, stresses, perhaps children or pets. And the management of all of those things together can sometimes cause conflict, right? And that's where the dynamics of power and control can come into play, especially when both partners bring with them, patterns of behavior and expectations about how relationships should work that they have internalized as kids, either from observing the way their parents operated in a relationship or didn't operate in a relationship.
That's right.
Or just, other relationship behavior modeled for them. And so am I on the right track with this,
That's
Dr.
right.
Tadros? Would you say I'm on the right track? Okay.
That's right.
So would you agree with me that we would consider a healthy relationship something that is consent-based, mutually fulfilling, and that there is a sharing of power and control when one party doesn't try to dominate over the other. Is that what we would call healthy or balanced?
So yes, so certainly the way you're describing is an ideal way, and certainly in a Western idealized way that where both parties have a healthy relationship, an uncoerced, non-coerced relationship that enlarges, allows each person to grow, and enlarges the relationship by enlarging each individual person to grow, even separately from the relationship. But people still come together. The couple still comes together at the end of the day to improve their relationship for whatever their purposes are, whether it's marriage or whether it's kids or whatever they wish for it to be. It needs to be consensual, and supportive.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so then I guess what we could say then is that like the conflicts that can lead to intimate partner violence or abuse stem from when there's an imbalance of power and a desire for control, right? Like if one person decides that they're going to use their power in order to wrest control from the other person. So in this case, the man desiring to control the woman.
That's right. And certainly, like you said before, we're going to focus on male-sponsored power and control. It certainly happens a bunch of different ways with different couples. But this, we're not just trying to hammer away at the guys here, but we'll talk about specific for the men. Traditionally, in many societies, and certainly in our Western society, men on average are bigger physically, and on average are the ones that initiate and perpetuate violence towards their partner. It's not all the time, it's not every time, it's not all males, but that's what we're going to focus on, this narrow piece, which is extremely, extremely important, and it affects so many people around them.
Absolutely. Okay. All right, so now we've kind of like laid the groundwork, and I've talked a lot. And I want to hand this over to you completely so you can drive us through this.
Sure.
Will you introduce us to this visual aid that we'll be referring to throughout the discussion called the Power and Control Wheel?
Yeah.
For people listening, we will absolutely link this image in the podcast description, as well as have it displayed in the background. If you're listening to us on YouTube, you'll just be able to see it on the screen there. So Dr. Tadros, tell us about the Power and Control Wheel.
Yeah, so this is developed back and released back in 1984 by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project out of Duluth, Minnesota. This is a visual, and like you said, it's literally a power and control wheel. It looks like a wheel or a tire or like a spokes that come to spokes of a wheel.
Like a bike tire.
Or a round pizza with slices.
Sure. Yeah.
And so there's a rim to the pizza pie, and there's the words violence and physical and sexual violence on the crust on the edge, and then each of the triangular wedges, we have 8 of them. And they all point towards the middle where there's a circle that's called power and control. So one way that this is interpreted is that women on the receiving end of violence, physical violence or sexual violence, are now have a heightened hypervigilance to the point that anything that happens afterwards, that the man perpetuates afterwards, even if it's not further physical or sexual violence, leads to him holding power and control over the woman. So that's one way, and I'll come back and talking about that.
Yeah, please do.
The other way of talking about it is the man wants power and control, whether he realizes it consciously or unconsciously, and then he uses certain techniques, these 8 wedges, to get all. And if he doesn't get his way, then it leads him to to distribute physical and sexual violence on his partner. So either way, it works both ways. Whether you start off with physical sexual violence, sensitizing the woman to knowing that she's in danger and making her hypervigilant, and then controlling her and then trying to control her from there versus...
Because she's constantly trying to prevent being re-traumatized.
That's right.
So you have de facto control. Okay, gotcha.
And I think that's... When people are terrorized. We talk about terrorism in other ways, but you don't have to repeat the terrorist act in order to frighten and control people.
Right.
It only has to happen once, and
Right.
sometimes it's years before. Doesn't have to happen weekly or monthly. Sometimes it's years before, and that's in order to protect herself, she has learned how to walk on eggshells, and that's
Right.
commonly talked about. Walking on eggshells, using all her energy to be hyper vigilant, to be always watchful, so that she doesn't trigger another violent act.
Provoke the reaction.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
So once again, round pie or round pizza, physical and sexual violence on the rim, and then the wedges. And this is the techniques that he uses, knowingly or unknowingly, to try to gain and to keep power and control over the woman. The first one is intimidation, making her afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying her property, abusing pets. That's a big one. Kicking pets and hurting pets,
Yeah.
and displaying weapons. So intimidation. He doesn't have to touch her, but it's around her.
Right.
The looks, the actions, the smashing of things, the hurting the pets, displaying weapons. So
Sort of
that's
makes her feel like the violence is just around the corner.
right.
Like
Right.
let's take
It's
one.
pending.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Next one is emotional abuse, such as putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy. That's the gaslighting.
Yeah. That's gaslighting.
Playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty. That's emotional abuse. Another way to get and maintain power and control over a woman. The next technique is isolation. This is controlling what she does, who she sees and talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting her outside involvement, using jealousy to justify his actions. So sometimes it's like, who are you talking to?
Right.
Why are you talking to your mom so many times a day?
Yeah.
That type of stuff.
Controlling her phone.
That's right.
Demanding her passwords, her passcodes, trying to read every single text message.
That's
yeah.
right. So far we've talked about
No privacy. Yeah.
That's right. Bingo. So far we've talked about intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation. The fourth way is minimizing and denying and blaming. This is making light of the abuse and not taking her concerns about it seriously, saying the abuse doesn't happen or didn't happen, shifting the responsibility for the abusive behavior, like, you didn't have dinner on time, this is why I hit you, saying that she caused it.
Right.
So blaming her, but also minimizing. I didn't hurt. I didn't hit you that hard. I didn't hit you that hard. I'll show you what it really.
I just pushed you.
Right.
You fell down.
Right.
Yeah.
And the next thing is using children. So making her feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages. They become go-betweens. Using visitation to harass her, threatening to take away the kids. So that's another technique to keep her under his thumb.
Yeah.
So intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, and then using the children. The next three are economic abuse, male privilege, and coercion and threats. So we'll talk about economic abuse, preventing her from getting or keeping a job, making her ask for money, giving her an allowance, taking her money, not letting her know about or having access to family income. Next one is male privilege, threatening her treating her like a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like he's the master of the castle, being the one to define men's and women's roles. And the final one, coercion and threats, making or carrying out threats to do something to her, threatening to leave her, threatening to commit suicide, threatening to report her to welfare, making her drop charges, making her do illegal things.
Wow.
So some of these sound, and most men don't really believe that they do this. They don't see themselves as abusers.
Sure.
And this is extremely important. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking they're out to get their wife. No woman gets up in the morning and thinks her boyfriend or husband is out to she's staying with a guy that's controlling her and abusing her. But unfortunately, this is kind of what happens in select situations, and it continues. And even after sometimes the police are called, or sometimes he gets emotional help, or takes medicines to help with their depression or their anger issues, and we could come talk about that, what it means. It still continues in a variety of ways, and I'll come back to that. So once again, physical and sexual violence can start this power and control structure, or it could be power and control wants to be achieved, and then therefore they go eventually to physical and sexual violence. So if they can't use intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing and denying, or using children, or using economic abuse, or using male privilege or coercion and threats, then they can escalate to physical and sexual violence. And unfortunately, we see this too often. Sometimes it's very subtle. It's not very overt. It's not every day. And certainly, whenever people have blowups, and then there's a lull, a quiet period,
Right.
and when people kind of get after people leave, go to their parents' house, go call the cops, and things are quiet, and people apologize sometimes, or out of fear, go back into the situation. Right. And it's a quiet time, and people don't want to get help during the quiet time because why stir up crap?
Sure, yeah.
Things are quiet for a little bit. Unfortunately, the cycle of violence repeats.
Mm-hmm. I think I want to check my understanding on the way this flows. So you talked about two ways this happens. So we talk about the outside, the crust of the pizza here with the physical and sexual violence. Sometimes the action moves from the outside of the pizza to the inside.
Right.
So physical or sexual violence occurs, which causes the woman to live in constant fear of the power and control of the spouse or the male partner. And then sometimes the male partner, from the inside out, the male partner's desire for power and control is so overwhelming to him that he starts using some of these tactics, intimidation, economic abuse, using the children in order to establish power and control over the woman. And then if those things don't work for him, he escalates to the physical act of violence or sexual violence.
That's correct.
Right? Okay, so
that's
it kind of it can flow both ways. That makes sense.
That's what I found in my practice. A lot of times it starts, obviously they've been drinking and he has been drinking, or both have been drinking, and he hits her, and then it goes from there. Now she's afraid, and now he's like, it wasn't so bad, and then he starts automatically using some of these techniques to keep her under his thumb, so she doesn't complain, she doesn't go to her mom or dad, doesn't go to the police, doesn't ask for a divorce, all that stuff.
Do you think there's kind of some, like a little bit of like a sinister reinforcement that happens here when a man realizes that, like, oh, this tactic is successful to get what I want?
That's right. What I'm going to come back and talk about how men get to this point where they even know how to use these things. It's not automatic. It's not. But the quick answer is yes. So once you can squash somebody and they shut up, it automatically reinforces that you can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. It worked. All right, tell us more.
So a lot of these men, and I know a lot of, especially in today's society, we're blaming men for a lot of things, but this is well before the more recent socioeconomic or issues that we've had for the last few years. But a lot of these men themselves have been abused, usually as children, sometimes physical, sexual, emotionally abused themselves. This is not an excuse, but an explanation. This is not an excuse. So we want men to stop immediately anything that any of the abuse and the trauma that they're delivering to the woman, but also they need help themselves. And oftentimes it's not just immediately since they've been abusing the woman, but for their own sexual traumas, their own physical and emotional traumas from their youth. It doesn't have to be parents. It could be relatives. It could be coaches. It could be bullying. All sorts of stuff. But they need their own help. In addition to stopping what they're doing now, that's harming the physically, emotionally, sexually harming their partner.
How does childhood trauma, so something bad happening to the young man, how does that then manifest in some of these externalizing behaviors where they start to treat another person badly?
Well, certainly, and you alluded to this earlier, people learn things. They don't have to go to class to learn things. They don't have to sit down and read a book to learn things. They learn things by watching, and literally it happens, from infancy. They watch how their parents behave towards each other, or towards other adults, or towards other children, and they develop their own fear, their own intimidation, their own feeling intimidated. And one of the ways to get rid of fear, intimidation, you can cower, you could run away, you can complain, you can go to authority. Right. But another way is to stand up and be angry and bully yourself.
Yeah.
And that's the other way of doing it. And some people cower and run away, and some people ask for help and other techniques. But a lot of people, a lot of young men, and we will talk about teenagers and dating. A lot of young men automatically learn that they can control their partner in select ways.
Yeah. Okay. Keep going.
This is for men and women, but in this case, we'll talk about men. There's something called the ACEs quiz, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and it's a quiz. It's online, and it talks about childhood traumatic experiences. Everything from deaths in your childhood to being abandoned emotionally or physically abandoned, etc. And you could rack up a score, and you could calculate a score and see how much trauma you endured in childhood. Once again, it's an explanation. It's not an excuse to traumatize somebody else.
Yeah.
But it's an explanation of what you may be going through or have gone through, and you didn't realize it. You just thought it was just normal that your parents had a terrible long divorce and that they separated, and that the dad didn't pay child support and your mom had to work 3 jobs and she was never available to you, because that's how you existed. That's how you got here. That's how you survived. So part of it is that when we're young, at any time in our life, but certainly whenever we're young, we have neuroplasticity. Our brains are making connections, memories, among other things. And some of these memories become imprinted in pathways, and it becomes automatic. So when you see it enough times, it becomes automatic. And then you start behaving, you start reinforcing and behaving that way without thinking so much, without anybody slowing you down and saying, hey, you realize you can talk. Hey, you realize that your anger is out of proportion to the situation.
Right.
Hey, you could ask for help. So what happens is that when these adults now come to us later in life, part of what I do, besides talking about their substance abuse and their trauma, is sometimes I have to give a medication to help what I call lengthen their fuse of anger. You hear people having a short fuse. Right. So some people, whether it's depression or bipolar disease or other things, we can help, quote unquote, lengthen their fuse so that they can see themselves, the anger swelling. People think that they, quote unquote, snap. It is not true that they snap. They have signs and symptoms well before the blow up or the violence. But they just don't recognize their signs and symptoms. And we can, through talk therapy, through trauma recovery techniques, and through sometimes medications, we can help them, number one, see what's happened to them, help them understand what the response is now towards their spouse or partner, that it reflects what happened to them also. Yeah. And that we can help them lengthen their fuse so that they can understand their anger and either step away from the situation, or go get help, ask for somebody to intervene before it progresses to harm.
That's great. I mean, hearing you say all that, just makes me think of the benefits of therapy in general about, establishing a practice of self-reflection.
Yes.
And really building a muscle and a tolerance for being able to not only examine your behavior, but also examine your intentions and expectations, and gaining some curiosity about why did I expect my wife to always have dinner on the table at this certain time, or always let me make the major decisions about finances or something. What does that stem from?
That's correct.
Instead of just, assuming that, well, she made me mad because she did this thing that made me mad.
That's right.
But having some of that curiosity and intellectual honesty to really question yourself and reflect on what some of these things might be causing. So, I mean, that's kind of an underlying deficiency, right? Not
That's
being
correct.
able to be self-reflective.
What you'll hear me say through a lot of these podcasts, a lot of people are, I'm just my nature and what I've watched people over decades. Most people want to do well. They don't wake up in the morning to crap on somebody else's life or to ruin their own life. But unfortunately, by the end of the day, they've crapped on other people's lives, or they've ruined their own lives in some fashion. So people, like you said, have to have help to slow down their day, to slow down and think about what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Right.
And it doesn't make sense. Is that what they really want? Is that the goal? Is that the response that they really want? Or if it is, did it come to too great of a cost?
Right.
You can control somebody, but it comes at a cost, a severe cost to physical health, emotional, financial health, legal issues. So you can get things your way, but the vast majority of people would argue that that's not what they really want in life. They want their wife to respect them and be happy and blah 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 because they And the answer is, unfortunately, that's not what happens.
Sure. I think I think obviously taking a hard look at the environments in which we grew up is
Yes.
a tremendous indicator of why some of those expectations exist, right? I mean, I
That's right.
experienced this going into my own marriage, realizing that I had some of these expectations of my husband to do things the way that my dad did them.
That's right.
And I thought just like those expectations were just fundamentally true and good because they were the ones that I was exposed to growing up. But they weren't necessarily my husband's expectations for how to behave. And
That's right.
so talk more about that. How, what you see as a child, what's modeled by your parents or other important adults in your life, how that can create, kind of normify, if you will. I don't know if that's a word or not.
Yeah, that's right.
All different kinds of behaviors that can even abusive behaviors.
That's right. It's the normalization, I think, is the word.
Normalize. There we go. Not normify.
That's right. That's okay. I knew what you meant. The normalization of tension in the household, or anger and frustration, or quiet blow up.
Yeah.
And a lot of men, a lot of their dads were like this. They're quiet, and they blew up.
Yeah.
Or substance use, where there was drinking, or it's typically alcohol. By far, it's alcohol, and domestic violence almost go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And practically all of male towards women, either it's not necessarily at the moment, but oftentimes they have alcohol-related issues, alcohol substance abuse issues, and so these are all linked. And once again, it's my purpose is to give reasons, not excuses. So when somebody grows up in a household where drinking is common or frequently is accepted, and fights happen whenever people are drinking, and people have to go into the room in order to avoid the anger and the violence, and so they kind of cower and hide and walk on eggshells and try to please, and then we end up with these children that eventually grow up to be adults who can't express themselves,
right,
have their own anger issues, and they don't know how to talk about it, they don't know how to ask for help. They use substances to kind of suppress their own their anger feelings, or depression or anxiety. So it feeds into it, and in order to break the cycle of violence is what we call it. The person who breaks the cycle of violence I see it as a chain reaction. If you're sitting with a bunch of in a car in a long line of cars on an interstate, and somebody reruns a couple of people behind you, that person reruns, and that person reruns, and then eventually gets to you. So it's a chain reaction down to you. But in order for you not to hit the car in front of you, you have to have you have to have space, and you have to have your brakes on. It's a huge correction in order to prevent transmitting the violence, transmitting the accident to the person in front of you. So you're the one that takes the last hit. And for me, that takes a lot of bravery.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
It takes a lot of support. And sometimes you can't save the marriage, you can't save the relationship, but you still have to be better for yourself. Not only for yourself, but for your children, if you have children, for your future partner, if you can't save this present relationship or your present marriage, for instance.
Sure. I think it's an act of tremendous bravery to admit that your patterns of behavior might be problematic. The way you use drugs or alcohol might be problematic. The way you treat your spouse or your children might be problematic.
That's right.
And then to learn some different ways of coping with those intense emotions that drives that negative behavior, like that is incredibly brave and intensely manly, honestly, to own up to something like that and change.
Our society certainly does not reward people openly for this, but in certain circles, men who support men who are trying to make these types of significant changes in their lives. And so oftentimes in the family, the immediate family or the immediate relationship, if they're still available, they're very appreciative. They're still waiting for the other shoe to fall. They're still waiting for the person to backslide, to go back to drinking, to go back to violence, go back to controlling. But I think people appreciate you not being perfect. They appreciate your trying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, big difference.
For sure. Just going back to this power and control wheel, I think it's interesting how there's the behaviors that are described in here kind of fall along a spectrum from like very aggressive behaviors to very passive
That's right.
exercises of control.
That's right.
And I think that it's important, especially for anyone who might be listening to this and thinking to themselves, I'm not an abuser. Like none of this describes me. This does not apply to me in any way.
That's right.
That, some of these more subtle behaviors can really cause a lot of harm. Just looking at a couple here, especially the emotional abuse. So, putting her down, calling her names. Maybe you're not calling her names, but making her think she's crazy. If your wife or female partner comes to you and says like, I'm really concerned about this. This is something that's
right.
upsetting me. And if you minimize it, deny it, downplay it, blame it on something else, that can create a tremendous amount of harm.
That's right.
And it's an exercise of power and control over that woman to behave that way.
Yes.
I think, another one as well where that's the same dynamic is sort of the kind of man of the house, master of the castle kind of attitude. We can see that play out with husbands especially feeling like they can have sex whenever they want it.
That's right.
That the wife needs to be available to them at all times. And, also just that the master of the castle has to be the one to define what the man's role is and what the woman's role is.
That's right.
Which all of that is an exercise in power and control.
Well, and men will use that. That's where my parents were married for X amount of years, and it worked for them. That's where you need to do it. Religion, people of certain faiths and certain cultures, they will use that. That was the way it's written down, and this is the way that this is the way it is. It's not from me. It's from somebody who knows more or has a higher power than I am. So we have to be sensitive to people's context and their culture and their faith. But by the same token, there's no woman that needs to be in a relationship where she's controlled or abused. There's not
coerced.
For no matter what the quote unquote reason is.
Right. Absolutely. No, I think that's actually a really great thing to point out. I think even in Christianity, there's this idea of complementarianism, right? That the man has a certain role and that the woman exists to be a helper to the man, and that they have different roles and responsibilities. I think that dynamic can still exist and play out without being abusive.
And that's important. And I'm glad you said that. People can argue without being controlling and abusive.
Right.
Now, the problem is if they've had a history of somebody's had a history of being controlled and abused, any argument from then on could be triggering. So this is the problem with when some men say, but I went through therapy and I blah, 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 and this has been 6 months or a year since I've yelled or threatened, et cetera. Why don't you blah, blah, blah? And it's because the person on the receiving end now has been traumatized enough that a lot of stuff triggers her. And it may trigger her for the rest of her life, by the way. It may not just be you. Anybody that puts her in that same situation that triggers these thoughts and feelings, these situations are enough. And so that's to be able to give a person permission, the spouse or girlfriend permission to have to go through her process and through her therapy in order to be accepting that things have changed and that she could de-escalate her hypervigilance.
Right.
And that takes a long time, and you can't force that on anybody, and you can't accelerate it by saying snap out of it. I haven't hit you in a year.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you brought that up because I think that that's really one of the consequences of some of these behaviors that really don't necessarily get appreciated. There's the immediate consequences of the actions that really get a lot of the spotlight, right? Like if someone hits you, there's a physical injury that happens right away. If someone takes your money away, there's an immediate thing that you can't buy.
That's correct.
But there are long-term effects to being hit once, being controlled in a certain area for, a period of time, being called a name once. Those things can reverberate through a person's psyche forever, just like childhood abuse
That's right.
can reverberate through your psyche and your personality the rest of your life. These harmful actions, harmful practices of power and control can reverberate like that in your spouse or female partner's life. And, in addition to the bravery of admitting you have an issue and accepting help and working on changing some of those behaviors, it also requires a tremendous amount of bravery to give your partner the grace and understanding that they have to work through it at their own time. They have to forgive you in their own time. They have to really, truly do their own therapy to deal with the trauma that you've caused them.
That's right.
It's just, it's the consequence of the behaviors.
I tell guys that it's not a finish line where, like, I went through therapy, I stopped hitting you, I stopped threatening, I stopped calling you names, I stopped controlling the checkbook and who you call. Now it's time for you to forgive and move on.
Right.
And it's hard for a guy who tends to be, let's pretend these men are oftentimes goal-oriented, like, okay, I did it, I've admitted it, I've taken the hit, I've taken the heat.
Check off the list.
Check off the list, let's move on. For her to keep bringing it back up, because that's how her brain and how her body works. There's the book, the gut body keeps score.
Yep.
So even if she quote unquote forgets, it's been years later, she still has the neurologic the brain tracks that reminds her to be safe and to be careful. Because something is the tension is piling up again, even years later.
And I can imagine that's such a that can come across to the man as malicious, almost as blaming, right?
Blaming again.
She's going to bring this up forever. We are never going to get past this. She is never going to let me live this down.
That's right.
And when that thought can be reframed as, wow, this is really a trauma response,
yes.
Right? It's not that she's going to micromanage me and remind me of my faults for the rest of my life.
That's
it's that there's a trauma response happening here.
People, and this is and once again, it's not to blame, it's to explain. And this is the same thing with parents towards their children, and especially parents towards the children that end up being abused or neglected, is we see the effects decades, probably lifelong later, of a variety of different ways. Some people are adult children of alcoholics. Oftentimes are wonderful people, but they tend to they're pleasers, and they overwork themselves to death, and to the point where they have to have therapy because they can't keep up the high standards that they've set for themselves, unconsciously sometimes. So we see these effects decades, even quote unquote positive things that are socially acceptable, like being obsessive about something positive. That we have these people. That is part of a trauma sometimes, not just the negative stuff, but some of the stuff that's socially acceptable that people are obsessive about, making money and stuff like that. So.
Some of those positive character traits or things even that we like about ourselves or pride ourselves on can actually be developed out of trauma.
That's right. For wanting to be perfectionist so that you wouldn't stir up trouble and get more pain from your youth.
Yeah. Absolutely. Such good stuff.
Right.
I think we should talk now about teens and how these same power and control dynamics can manifest in relationships between teens and can just pop up even for young men that have never had any experience with the frustration of a marriage or anything like that.
So when teens start dating, and this is something that I would kind of grab my attention early on in my practice, we'll have young women who are in a terribly abusive relationship whenever they're 14 or 15. And I'm sure teenagers, or some people are preteen, they sometimes start dating. But the ones I see, because I was an internist, I didn't see that much younger than 14 or 15. But they're already in abusive relationships. The boy will hit, maybe not drinking, maybe it's stuff like that, but they will hit and threaten and force sex or coerce sex. And this is the first or second time that person that they've been dating. And so very early on, not just in your 20s and 30s or 40s, this is very early on that we run into this. So we actually have to talk about this for youngsters before high school potentially. Maybe not at the level we're talking here, but at a level that they can understand. And oftentimes, once again, it's because of their family of origin or the household that they grew up in, and some of what was modeled for them when adults didn't realize that they were modeling this type of behavior for the children who were, and sometimes they don't see it, but they can hear it through the walls. So this is it's already difficult whenever you have to deal with as a dad of daughters myself, or as a physician, that we already have traumatized young girls with the first or second person that they've been dating be already in this power and control situation.
Yeah, I think part of the skills or whatever that we need to develop in young people so that they don't, maybe if they did grow up in an environment where they were modeled, abusive or controlling behaviors or whatever, but maybe they were modeled great behaviors, we still have to teach young people emotional regulation.
Yes.
And if you're unable to regulate your emotions, you're going to lash out in response or do something that's a disproportionate response to whatever it is that's bothering you.
Yes.
And I think that's probably something that we see with young men who act out physically against their girlfriends. They don't know how to deal with
absolutely
these emotions that are bubbling up in them, that they feel like she's shaming them or being disrespectful or challenging their manhood.
Yes.
And some of those are like very visceral things when someone pushes a button like that. So we need to, be able to teach young men how to identify that emotion,
right,
and then build in the steps to give that distance,
right,
from what they want to react with to what they actually do react with.
Part of masculinity, I know the word masculinity means a lot of different things to people, but for me, masculinity is the strength to have emotional regulation.
Yeah.
Good for you. Thank you for using the word emotional control, emotional regulation. Not just to stuff it and to be angry and stew and brew inside, but to be able to recognize it and to ask for help or ask for space or to apologize and step away and understand that it's not just that. This means that something's happened to you, and that you don't want to deliver to the person that you're around, you're dating, etc.
Yeah. I think now's a good opportunity to revisit what you kind of pointed out before, which is that, there's kind of this societal target on men right now.
Sure.
There's, men are taking a lot of heat in general. As the world starts to examine some of the real issues with male dominance and patriarchal structures, and I think that can leave men feeling like they're being attacked for being themselves, and that the world is saying that masculinity is a negative thing, a bad thing. So we just said that there's good men understand themselves, right?
Yes.
They understand their feelings. They can communicate their needs in a way that doesn't cause harm or abuse to other people.
Yes.
And they can manage their emotions. They have good coping skills to manage intense emotions. So can you talk about how understanding what we've talked about today, the dynamics of power and control, and how they can go wrong, how that helps men understand themselves better and then therefore be better versions of themselves for themselves and for the women that they love.
And I'm glad that we're going to put this up on our website because it's important to the visual. We tried to describe it, but it's important to visualize this, and we'll have some other resources. But sometimes it's a little bit late once you're angry once, twice, or you've hit somebody, and then you realize this should not be me. This is not, or I don't want to propagate what's happened to me. You still have to apologize. You still have to get help.
Right.
But then you have to recognize it's not just a superficial, it's not just a one-time thing. Yeah. This is sometimes an ingrained belief system that you are allowed to, or it's okay to in certain situations, be controlling and abusive. And so this is the challenge, because then you're challenging sometimes society, what allows you, what your family or what your culture has allowed you or reinforced, or you got in a little bit of trouble, but not all the way. The cops were called, but they said, take care of it yourself. Nobody's that hurt. We're not gonna write this up, right, etc. So sometimes you squeak by, but sometimes that's a red flag that you need a lot more help. And it's not just bad day or you're just drinking that day, that it's much more ingrained in how you see the world, how you see yourself, your rights.
What you're entitled to.
To. A lot of guys that I've run into just want things to be better and more controlled. So if they find things are chaotic or not controlled by their standards, by their vision, the woman's talking too much, the woman's spending too much money, the woman is not where she said she was going to be, the meal's not on the table, the kids are a mess. So if they see it from their standpoint that things are out of control, then that's when they feel like they have to rein things in and they have to become physical or violent or intimidate, etc. They may not use those words. They may not realize what they're doing, but that's exactly what's happening. So a lot of it goes down to why does it have to be that the dinner has to be on the table? Why does it have to be that the kids are perfect?
Yeah.
Why does it have to be that that the house is perfect?
Examining those expectations with a critical eye.
That's correct. And so I'm not saying that some of those features are not, some of those values are not great, but to get to achieve them through violence, through anger and hate and intimidation, is not okay.
Right. It comes at too great a cost, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, some of this behavior is illegal.
Yeah.
So I never want to use that as a stick, but I want the care, because I want people to have long-term relationships with each other, with positive reinforcing. But certainly, the legal system is unfortunately, a lot of mental health issues, men and women, are set up as in a legal way rather than a more mental health and need help way. So, but some people is so far gone, so significant that the legal system has to get involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we want to offer definitely a positive view and a positive message about masculinity here. We definitely don't want anyone to interpret this as coming down on men hard. I hope this wasn't too triggering to anybody, but led to some good reflection and maybe some good discussions in partnerships. We do have some resources here that we want to refer people to. First of all, there is a St. Louis area resource directory. There's a website called startherestl.org. That's kind of a directory for lots of different things in the St. Louis area. But their domestic violence page specifically has a comprehensive list of resources for all kinds of people in all kinds of situations. Domestic violence hotlines, support groups, bilingual services, all different kinds of stuff.
We should mention that help for women who have children.
Yes.
And also women who require financial support.
Sure.
Also men should be able to get some assistance through this system.
Absolutely.
Here in St. Louis.
Yeah. And definitely that list on startherestl.org is going to have a couple of those, like National Domestic Violence Hotline, like I shared, and other kind of national resources that have great FAQ, frequently asked questions sections that you can refer to if you want to look for a quiz or you want to understand more about what domestic violence looks like, what abusive behavior looks like, and help that with your self-examination. Like, please avail yourself of those resources. I certainly want to put a plug in for one resource that is also listed on that list, and that's Safe Connections.
Yes.
Safe Connections is a great organization here in the St. Louis area. They do a lot of work they have crisis intervention for families. They have a 24-hour hotline. They also have some great support groups, and particularly a training program for teenagers to help to, sort of head off at the pass some of the things that we were talking about today. They talk about gender roles. They talk about, like de-escalation and emotional regulation and dealing with conflict within relationships. So Safe Connections is an excellent resource as well.
I encourage people to take their ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience questionnaire, and look at their score. I think it's eye-opening for people in all walks of life to figure out some of the childhood trauma that oftentimes shows up not only in potentially power and control issues and violence issues, but also in depression and anxiety and trauma, PTSD. So that's the first thing. The next thing is also anybody with substance abuse issues that should be taken care of alongside, in addition to, not just because just taking care of the power and control and violence issues does not automatically take care of the depression or substance abuse issues, or
and vice versa.
Yeah, that's correct. The next thing is that people oftentimes become depressed and despondent and suicidal, and we always want people to reach out for the international number, our national number, the 988. This is for suicide prevention hotline.
Yep.
So that's we understand that some things are so far gone that people only see one way out, suicide.
Yeah.
And there's always help. If you can't see a light at the end of the tunnel, other people can for you. Loved ones and your physicians and nurse practitioners and physician's assistants and nurses and psychologists and et cetera. But also there's a 24 hours a day is the 988 number. Please let your physicians and your other primary care mental health professionals know what's happening in your life.
Right.
Oftentimes, you by just listening to us today, sometimes you know more than they do, but they are oftentimes the gateway to getting further help, either from them or somebody else that's local. So that's wonderful.
Correct. Yeah. So once again, just to end on a hopeful note, there is definitely help out there if you see yourself in any of these behaviors here. And once again, admitting that you have any kind of issue or problem is a tremendous act of bravery, right?
That's right.
That, identifying, being presented with new information and realizing that it might apply to you.
Yes.
And then doing something about it and taking accountability for those actions.
That's right.
Tremendously brave.
It's not only for you, it's also for your children. If you're involved with children, they learn from not just the difficulties that you have, but also some of your grit and stick-to-itiveness in
and
terms
how you
of
work
getting help.
through it.
That's
Absolutely.
Right, getting help.
Yeah.
That's right. So you're not only doing it for yourself, you're doing it for your partner, you're doing it for your kids. You're stopping the cycle of violence. And if something like this has ever happened to you in your youth, then finally you can tell your story and get help yourself. Yes.
Absolutely.
By the way, we talk about this. One of the most difficult calls a police officer gets is domestic violence. In fact, absolutely. That's one of the highest risk of a police officer becoming assaulted himself or stabbed or shot is domestic violence.
Yeah.
So it's some of the scariest calls that police officers come in on whenever they're dealing with family, domestic violence issues. So police officers nowadays have much more education about mental illness and domestic violence issues, non-lethal methods to de-escalate and et cetera. And I applaud and I encourage all law enforcement for this type of training.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. I think we've given everybody a lot to chew on today.
Yeah.
But hopefully seeing hope.
That's right.
There's light at the end of the tunnel.
Change could be made.
Absolutely.
You and I were talking about the potential for change, and people think that people are rigid from birth, and it's not true.
Yeah.
Some small part of you is going to be the same between 6 and 80, age 6 and 80, but there is change, and the change starts with you.
Absolutely.
And getting help.
You might be right-handed your entire life, but you don't have to be emotionally abusive or
That's correct.
Neglectful.
Yep.
All right. So thank you guys so much for sticking with us today. I know that was a heavy one, but I feel like it was a really useful and needed discussion. Please, once again, refer to the resources that we're going to have for you in the podcast description. If you have any questions for the doc or ideas that you would like us to explore on the pod, please send us an email at notyourdocpod@gmail.com. Again, notyourdocpod@gmail.com. Oh, Dr. Tedros.
We should do
was
something
a good
lighthearted.
one.
Yeah, we should do something lighthearted next time.
No, that was a good one. I feel really
was.
good about that.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for guiding us through this quagmire of information.
It was good stuff.
Yeah.
We'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks for hanging around.
Bye now. This previous podcast represents my opinions and the opinions of my guests. This is not medical advice, and I'm not establishing a physician-patient relationship with any listener. The content here should not be taken as medical advice. The content here is for informational purposes only, and because each patient is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions that you may have.